I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Very carefully now, we're going to a part of the world that's far away, another galaxy. It's the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. This is a part of Africa, East Africa, that is desired because of the natural resources of the interior of Africa. These ports enter into the Indian Ocean basin, and that means China and India and all of Asia can use these ports and this access to Africa. But it's divided up, the colonial powers left a legacy of conflict. A famous, infamous conflict of the 20th century was Ethiopia and Eritrea. Gregory Copley of Defense and Foreign Affairs is going to take us now to a new aspirational state. This is Somaliland, that was knitted together with Somalia. That's the same way of saying anarchy back in the 20th century, Somalia. But now it asserts that it is a separate country, as it was before, Somaliland. And the major players in this contest, this is not just the Game of Thrones, this is a game of ports, are Djibouti, which is itself a living port, where the U.S. and China both have military installations right now to develop that port. Also Ethiopia, at odds with all of the players here, especially Eritrea. Most importantly, however, Egypt under President Sisi. Its military power, its authority, and its alliance with Saudi Arabia. See how the map grows? Saudi Arabia is at war in Yemen for the Arabian Gulf and the power of the Gulf. It's at war, surrogate war with Tehran. But now it has entered into the game of ports in East Africa and the Red Sea basin. Gregory, a very good evening to you. My introduction needs correction. Please do it. But I want to begin with Somaliland. It is not a separate sovereignty, but it presents itself as a separate sovereignty. Why is it working with Egypt? Why is Egypt working with Somaliland? What do they want together? And then we'll go to the other states. Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Well, Somaliland is, in fact, an historical geopolitical entity quite separate from what is now left of the rump of Somalia. We did have three Somalilands: French Somaliland, British Somaliland, and Italian Somaliland. The British and Italian areas after World War II were consolidated under British control, and then Britain gave them independence in 1960. And shortly thereafter, these sovereign, recognized, independent nations joined together to create Somalia, the Union of Somalia. And it was only then that the Italian area, former Italian Somaliland, started a war against the former British part, which, as I say, is geopolitically quite separate and distinct clans from the Italian area, and it started a war which devastated Somaliland, British Somaliland, and the Egyptians helped what was Italian Somaliland to suppress and to basically conduct a genocidal war against the British Somaliland peoples. So when they could, with the death of the warlords in Somalia, British Somaliland once again reasserted its independence, and that fitted within the Organization of African Unity and the later African Union strictures, which said that a country which was sovereign and recognized before could reassert its sovereignty, as did Egypt and Syria, Egypt and Libya after they declared their United Arab Republics and so on. But Egypt always blocked the recognition of former British Somaliland, which had reasserted itself as the Republic of Somaliland. Republic of Somaliland is critical because it has a lot of mineral resources and oil reserves. It also has the very strategic port of Berbera, literally at the bottom end of the Red Sea, and that was established as a giant port with a commensurately giant airfield alongside it by the Soviets and then used by the U.S. during the Cold War. So it's very strategically placed, and of course it's adjacent to both the Puntland area of Somalia on the right, if you like, and on the left in the map it's adjacent to Ethiopia and Djibouti. And Djibouti and Berbera have essentially been rival ports, and the ethnically Somali clans in both Djibouti, the Afar and Isas tribes, have been slightly at odds with some of the clans in British Somaliland, who are also at odds with the clans in Puntland and the rest of Somalia. So it's all about clan warfare which has historically been driven by control of wells, water wells, because that's the great wealth of that area. If you have any wealth, it is water, which gives you the life, of course. So what Egypt now needs to do, because it's afraid of the situation in Ethiopia, it has been attempting to negotiate with Ethiopia to stop Ethiopia building the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or the Millennium Dam, on the Blue Nile, which Egypt asserts will interrupt the flow of Nile waters. And the interruption to the Nile water flow is what Cairo calls the only casus belli automatically, which, in other words, it would automatically go to war if the Nile waters were interrupted. The Ethiopians say that the dam will not affect the Nile water flow, but there's been really an out-of-sync negotiation which has frustrated the Egyptians, who have now returned to the old position under Mubarak and Morsi, which is to bottle up Ethiopia and cut it off from its trade routes. And by attempting to build relations with Somaliland, they hope to deny Ethiopia the use of the port of Somaliland. Now, the Egyptians have offered all manner of support, military aid, medical aid, and so on, of late. But the reality is that this Egyptian delegation, which was just there and met with the government, which warmly received it, but it's a corrupt and decaying government, which has been, frankly, supporting the Al-Shabaab movement in the Horn of
This
Africa.
is Solano's government, is that it?
Yes. Called Mia Party
the
government.
Somaliland government, and Egypt is entreating it, but it's disregarded by its own people, who I guess do not want Egypt. They want Ethiopia, the clans.
Correct. Ethiopia has always supported the sovereignty of Somaliland, sent troops to help when necessary, and bolstered Somaliland all through this period. Now, Egypt's saying, well, we'll recognize you diplomatically, and most Somalilanders are saying, oh, yeah, well, how come you didn't do that before? How come Egypt was always the one which, in the African Union, always vetoed recognition of Somaliland? So basically, this has become a competition. Right now, of course, Ethiopia is developing that port in Berbera to modernize it. But the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the UAE, particularly I think Dubai ports, want to take over Berbera to control it as the great entrepot of that region. And Egypt has been working with the Saudis and the UAE further up the coast in Eritrea as well to help with the occupy and use the ports, Eritrean ports.
All right, let me understand this, Gregory. Egypt is looking, this is very strategic thinking and kind of fantastic to me. Egypt is looking to entreat Berbera, to make that port, to influence that port. Djibouti is American and Chinese, and I suppose Egyptians have entreaties to Djibouti, and then Eritrea favors Egypt. There are 2 ports in Eritrea on the Red Sea. So Egypt is looking to have a hand in all 4 ports to cut Ethiopia off from access to the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and to the Indian Ocean basin. And that is to pressure Ethiopia to do what? To unbuild the dam, to cooperate with Egypt? What do they want from Ethiopia?
Well, they do want guarantees from Ethiopia that the Nile waters won't be interrupted, and because the classic mantra in Cairo is that Egypt is a gift of the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said in one of my reports, the reality is that the Nile is the gift of Ethiopia, because the bulk of the waters and the origin of the Blue Nile are at Lake Tana in Ethiopia's Amhara highlands. So the reality is that the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is now looking like it will cost about 15% of Ethiopian GDP, which means that it will never be completed. So the reality is that the dam will probably stop at a lower height than it was anticipated, if that's feasible. It's a huge amount of work's already been done. The reality is that the dam was meant to be a huge generator of hydroelectricity, which was then going to be, because it's right on the Sudan border, would sell the energy mostly to Sudan and be a hard currency earner for Ethiopia. The reality is that Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular are the ones using Eritrea at the moment, and they've started putting military forces in Nasab and Massawa, and they're using that to project power into Yemen. The Egyptian forces are also helping with that, and the Egyptians have actually sent troops down to springboard off Berbera already to go into Aden and so on, because Aden is literally a stone's throw across the...
So the Egyptians are already present in Berbera. They're there.
Correct.
Djibouti is secure because of the U.S. and China, and Eritrea favors Egypt. It looks like Ethiopia has been outmaneuvered.
It looks like it, but the reality is that the Somaliland National Armed Forces have basically told the government of President Solanyo, and President Solanyo is more or less out to lunch at the moment, health-wise, that they will not tolerate an alliance with Egypt. They want an alliance with Ethiopia. The question is whether the essentially hidebound and moribund Ethiopian government can break its tradition and immediately provide full diplomatic recognition to Somaliland now. They've hesitated, I think, for the last few years because President Solanyo has been an untrustworthy partner in Somaliland and has allowed the incredible progress and stability of Somaliland to degrade, including support for a lot of corrupt money laundering projects with Dubai and UAE generally, and also with Qatar, and to support the Al-Shabaab Islamists and pan-Somalists. So Ethiopia's been very nervous about that, but it now looks as though the elections are going to take place, finally overdue elections for the presidency in Somaliland in March next year. And at that point, even with the most flagrant rigging, it's hard to see how the Kulmiya party of President Solanyo can get back into office. President Solanyo himself is too ill to run again, is basically not functioning, and the party is falling apart.
So Somaliland is unstable. Gregory, when we come back, I want to ask about Saudi Arabia, because that's the great big deep pocket we haven't integrated into this conversation of the Game of Thrones, Game of Ports, and also about Sudan. Khartoum does have that port of Port Sudan. I wonder if that's a factor for Egypt as well. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Gregory Copley, my guide to a part of the world that I can only imagine and read about. This is the Horn of Africa, Somaliland, and the Gulf of Aden, reaching into the Red Sea, the passageway through to the Mediterranean. But also now it has ports, Berbera, Djibouti. There are 2 ports in Eritrea, and then there's the Port Sudan of Sudan. All of those ports are critical to the development of Africa's natural resources to be extracted and moved into the Indian Ocean basin for China for the 21st, 22nd century. That's the prospect here. And the African nations, the East African nations, and the Sub-Saharan African nations are all aware of this possibility of riches. These governments are not transparent, and they're moving around anticipating the planning and the building of these ports and the connecting railroads, the electricity, the pipelines, all of that to come. Gregory, I want to talk about Saudi Arabia because they're in Riyadh. They're fighting a civil war in Syria. They're fighting a civil war, I guess, in Iraq. They're certainly fighting a civil war in Yemen. And they're in league with Egypt at this point. So does Saudi Arabia, the deep pocket, the head of the 2 mosques, does it want Somaliland? Does it want Eritrea? Does it want Djibouti to link up with Egypt? Is that what they're being told?
Well, both the Saudis and the Egyptians have as a very high strategic priority stability of the Red Sea Suez sea lanes. That's critical to the economic viability of both countries.
Right.
And as a result, this latest historic visit by King Salman of Saudi Arabia to Egypt last week was quite profound, and it resulted in something which has shaken President Sisi's authority in Cairo. Part of the deal was to get all this money from Saudi Arabia, which has been enormous and has saved the Egyptian economy. The money from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE. But what President Sisi did without any prior warning, although there's been about 6 years of negotiations, he returned to Saudi Arabia two very strategic islands in the Red Sea, the islands of Tiran and Salafir. Now, these are in the Straits of Tiran, which lead from the Red Sea up into the Gulf of Aqaba. So, therefore, they are critical to controlling the Straits of Tiran, which means that the Israeli traffic out of Eilat and the Jordanian traffic out of Aqaba. So they're now back in Saudi hands. This outraged most Egyptians who said that basically al-Sisi had given away Egypt's territory for money. The reality was that in 1950 these Saudi islands were handed over for occupation by the Saudis to Egypt, so that Egypt would stop any incursion by Israel and any attempt by Israel to take over these islands. So Egypt has been occupying them since 1950, but they are nonetheless Saudi sovereign territory, which Egypt never denied. But they formed a key part of the Camp David Accords because the Egyptian government and with the Israelis agreed to allow the stationing of international peacekeepers on Tiran, basically to protect the peace between Egypt and Israel. And they've worked there. Now, the Saudis, in taking back the islands, have said, well, those peacekeepers can still stay there, which ironically has Saudi Arabia recognizing the Camp David Accords, which actually legitimized the Egypt-Israel relationship. So it's quite an irony there. But it was necessary for President al-Sisi to keep Saudi Arabia on side, and this will result, by the way, in a new bridge being built from the Sinai, north of Sharm el-Sheikh, across to the islands, right, and then up to Saudi Arabia, which will provide a strong link. So their whole look is literally from the top of the Red Sea right down to the foot of the
and this supports the overall plan that Saudi Arabia will work with Egypt in order to maintain control of these ports.
Correct. But Saudi Arabia no longer has deep pockets. It's blown through much of the $800 billion or so dollars of sovereign wealth fund in order to sustain the economy, the Saudi economy, during the oil price recession. It's running through that, and very soon will be into deficit budgets for the first time, literally, in its modern history, and at a time when its oil and gas reserves are slated to be exhausted by about 2028. So we're seeing Saudi Arabia facing an existential threat within the next decade or so, at a time when about 20 million of its 29 million or so population are in fact migrant workers. So it's going to have to do something really significant to transform its economy. So its investment in creating a single market, in a sense, with Egypt is not only highly favorable to Egypt, but it will be critical to the survival of Saudi Arabia.
We have about a minute, Gregory. What's a timeline for Egypt to secure these ports and bring Ethiopia to bear? How long do they have for Ethiopia to give in?
Well, I think Ethiopia is giving in because it economically can't afford the new dam. Mm-hmm. So the reality is that what we need to see is the Ethiopian government get a new prime minister, which it's working to do. It's got a caretaker prime minister.
And recognize Somaliland.
And then negotiate with Egypt, which it can and will do if it gets a stable government.
And this would introduce the concept of peace in the Horn of Africa, if that happened, if Cairo was able to work with Addis Ababa.
And that would lead to a very large, unified and harmonious marketplace, which could be the next big growth area, both in terms of local markets and in terms of as a world crossroad.
Gregory Copley, the editor and publisher of Defense and Foreign Affairs, a journey to the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea Basin, the Gulf of Aden, the Indian Ocean Basin. This is about the future. This is about my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and in developing Africa, integrating it into the industrial base of Asia. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.